On a quiet evening in a residential neighborhood in Florida, the police received an emergency call from Pastor Elijah King's neighbor. Piercing screams, the sounds of a violent struggle, and then a chilling silence left them no choice but to intervene. When they arrived at the scene, they found Elijah sitting on the porch, his clothes soaked in blood, gripping a Bible tightly. He did not attempt to flee, nor did he resist. As the officers approached, Elijah looked up with empty eyes and uttered a single sentence. "It's over." Inside the house, the scene before them sent shivers down, even the most seasoned investigators' spines. Two lifeless bodies, one male, one female, lay motionless in pools of blood. The evidence at the scene suggested that this was no ordinary murder, but an act driven by deep-seated hatred. The police quickly identified the victims: Naomi King, Elijah's wife, and Henry King, his biological father. A God-fearing pastor, admired by his community. Why would he murder his own wife and father? What could push a man who once preached morality and love to completely lose control? This was not just a homicide. It was a family tragedy, entangled with a dark secret buried for years. A secret so devastating that when it surfaced, it shattered trust, faith, and an entire life. Is Elijah King a ruthless killer? Or is he merely a victim of a truth too unbearable to handle? Do you believe there's a limit beyond which a person can no longer hold on to their sanity? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to follow for more shocking crime stories. Elijah King, 42, was a devoted and respected pastor within his community. He led his congregation with sermons on faith, morality, and family values. To those around him, he was the embodiment of an ideal husband and father, always putting his family and religion above all else. His wife, Naomi King, 38, was a gentle and dedicated woman. She not only managed their household, but was also actively involved in charity work at the church. They had 5 children: Abigail, 16, Elijah Jr., 14, Noah, 12, Sophie, 9, and Micah, 6. The King family was seen as the model of a perfect home, where virtue and love reigned supreme. Henry King, Elijah's father, was the most influential figure in the family. At 65, he was a respected elder in the church. Since childhood, Elijah had been taught by Henry about faith, devotion, and loyalty to God. To Elijah, his father was not just a teacher, but also a role model to follow. Every Sunday, the King family gathered at Henry's house for dinner, a long-standing tradition where they read the Bible together and shared stories about their lives. But during what seemed like an ordinary dinner, Abigail, Elijah's eldest daughter, suggested doing a DNA test for a school project. The children were excited about the idea, but Naomi hesitated, citing concerns about privacy and the accuracy of such tests. As his children eagerly anticipated the experiment, Elijah remained silent throughout dinner, offering no opinion, just observing everyone with an unreadable expression. The DNA test proceeded as planned, and no one thought much of it. But what the family didn't know was that this simple experiment would unravel a horrifying truth, a secret powerful enough to shatter everything they had ever believed in. Do you think some secrets should remain buried forever? Or should the truth always come to light, no matter how painful? Share your thoughts. That evening, the King family sat together around the dinner table. The children excitedly shared stories about school, while Elijah and Naomi listened. Amid the lively conversation, Abigail, the eldest daughter, enthusiastically talked about her genealogy research project. She suggested that the whole family take a DNA test to trace their ancestry. The kids were thrilled, eagerly guessing where their bloodline might originate. Elijah found the idea interesting, but Naomi seemed hesitant. She looked down at the table, her fingers tightening slightly around her fork. She argued that DNA tests could be inaccurate and unnecessary. Henry, the family's patriarch, simply nodded in agreement without expressing an opinion, his eyes briefly clouded with contemplation. Despite Naomi's reluctance, Elijah decided to order the test. To him, it was just a simple activity. No one imagined it would change everything. A few weeks later, the results arrived. Elijah opened the email with excitement, anticipating an interesting discovery. But as his eyes scanned the report, he froze. His name was not listed as the biological father of any of the children. He blinked, convinced there had to be a mistake. This couldn't be real. Elijah immediately contacted the DNA testing company to verify the results. They confirmed that the analysis was entirely accurate. There was no error. He requested a reevaluation, but the answer remained the same. The results were indisputable. Confusion turned into overwhelming dread. If he wasn't the biological father of his children, then who was? Elijah scrolled through the data, rereading it over and over, and then the truth slowly emerged. The children's DNA matched another family member, and that person was Henry. A cold chill ran through Elijah's body. The man he had revered, the father who had raised him with strict moral principles, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Everything he had believed in, everything he had loved, was now shattered. This was no longer a family. It was a lie that had been stretched out for years. Elijah sat in silence, gripping the DNA test results. How was he supposed to face this truth? Elijah sat frozen, his eyes locked on the DNA test results. Inside him, everything was crumbling. His entire life, he had believed in family, in love, in the respect he held for the father who had raised him. But now, it was all nothing more than a vicious web of lies. Naomi had betrayed him, but what he couldn't accept was that the one who had truly deceived him was Henry, the man he had once seen as a moral pillar. A fire of rage ignited inside him, but he held it back. He needed to hear the truth from Naomi. He walked into the living room, where she sat anxiously, her eyes red and swollen. When she met Elijah's furious gaze, there was nowhere left to run. She confessed everything. In the early years of their marriage, Henry had used his power and position to force himself upon her. Naomi had lived in fear, unable to resist and too terrified to tell anyone. Elijah was stunned. The woman he had loved, the wife he had trusted, had suffered in silence. But what hurt even more was that she had never spoken up, had let him live in this lie for so many years. He felt betrayed not only by Henry, but also by Naomi. His anger surged. Everything he had known, believed in, and loved was now nothing more than a cruel joke. His fists clenched as he struggled to control his breathing, but his mind was in turmoil. Everything had collapsed. What was real? Where was the family he had once thought he had? Unable to stay in the house, Elijah stormed out, driving aimlessly. His thoughts spiraled, memories clashing with each other, and Henry's words about morality now rang in his ears as bitter mockery. He pulled over to the side of the road, his head in his hands. What was he supposed to do? Could he forgive this? Or was the betrayal too great to overlook? The rage inside him didn't fade. It grew, transforming into an overwhelming need to confront Henry, the man who had destroyed his family, stolen his dignity, and dragged him into an unimaginable tragedy. Elijah knew he couldn't just let this go. He had to face Henry. And this time, he needed answers. If you were Elijah, what would you do in this situation? Confront or walk away? Share your thoughts. The fury inside Elijah erupted, uncontrollable and all-consuming. He no longer saw Henry as a father, but as the man who had destroyed his life. The betrayal was too immense, too profound to be forgiven. That night, Elijah returned home, his mind spiraling with endless thoughts. Naomi sat in the living room, her eyes swollen from crying. She knew Elijah had confronted Henry, but had no idea how he would react. She stepped forward, about to say something, but it was too late. Elijah pulled a knife from his pocket, his eyes burning with rage. "Why did you let this happen?" he growled, his voice filled with anger, pain, and despair. Naomi stepped back, fear washing over her. "Elijah, please, calm down." But there was no reasoning with him now. He was no longer the man he had been yesterday. The blade pierced Naomi's flesh, her scream slicing through the air, blood spread across the floor. She tried to resist, but it was futile. Her body collapsed, writhing in agony before falling still. Elijah stood over her, staring at the woman who had been by his side for years, now nothing more than a lifeless form on the ground. But his rage was not yet satisfied. He left the house, driving into the night, heading straight for Henry's home. The door was unlocked. Henry sat in his chair, as if expecting Elijah's return. "Why have you come back?" he asked, his voice devoid of fear. But Elijah didn't want to hear any more words. He lunged forward, the knife flashing. Henry fought back, but age had weakened him. Elijah struck over and over, each stab an outlet for his rage, his grief, his indescribable pain. Silence fell over the room. Elijah stepped back, staring at Henry's motionless body. But he wasn't done. He carried out one final act, a gruesome punishment for the man who had shattered his family. When Elijah finally left Henry's house, his clothes were drenched in blood, his hands trembling. But his mind was quiet. The vengeance was complete. Hours later, the police received a call from a neighbor reporting screams and violent commotion. When they arrived at the scene, they found a horrific sight. Both Naomi and Henry dead, blood soaking the floors. And Elijah, he hadn't run. He sat on Henry's porch, a Bible resting on his lap, his eyes hollow and distant. As the officers approached, he spoke only one sentence: "Justice has been served." The piercing sound of police sirens shattered the quiet night. Red and blue lights flashed against the houses of the small neighborhood as officers rushed to the scene. The emergency call had been chilling. Screams, a violent struggle, then silence. What they found inside left even the most seasoned investigators stunned. Naomi's body lay sprawled across the floor, a long trail of blood marking her final moments. Her lifeless eyes were frozen in terror. In another house, Henry King had met the same fate, his body battered and torn. The crime scene bore the unmistakable marks of unrestrained fury. But the killer had not fled. Elijah sat on the front steps of his father's house, his clothes drenched in blood, his gaze vacant. A Bible rested on his lap, his hands still trembling. When the officers approached, he did not resist. There were no pleas, no justifications, no attempts to escape. Only one sentence passed his lips: "Justice has been served." Elijah was handcuffed and taken into custody that very night. During his interrogation, he remained emotionless. His voice was steady, devoid of hesitation, as he recounted everything that had transpired. He did not deny a single detail. Every word he spoke sounded like an indictment against himself. When asked why he had done it, his response was simple: "I had no other choice." Forensic analysis confirmed what was already evident. The murder weapon matched the wounds on both victims. Every shred of evidence pointed to one inescapable conclusion: Elijah was the killer. But this was no ordinary crime. It wasn't about money or petty revenge. It was a family tragedy pushed beyond its limits. As news of the murders spread, the town was in shock. A once revered pastor, a man who had preached about morality and family, was now a murderer. Those who had admired Elijah struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the man who had committed these acts. For those who knew the full story, the real question was no longer why, but could this have been prevented? With overwhelming evidence against him, authorities formally charged Elijah King with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His trial date was set. Elijah had taken justice into his own hands. But was it the right thing to do? Do you believe he deserves the harshest punishment, or does he still deserve some measure of understanding? Share your thoughts below. News of the double homicide spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through the community. A once respected pastor now stood as the accused in a brutal murder case. Public opinion was divided. Some saw Elijah as an unforgivable killer, while others believed he was merely a victim of an unimaginable betrayal. But, regardless of sentiment, the law had to be upheld. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution argued that this was a premeditated act of murder, one that could not be excused by emotions. They emphasized the brutality of Elijah's actions, particularly in the case of Henry. Meanwhile, the defense sought to prove that Elijah had been pushed beyond his breaking point. They presented evidence of Henry's abuse of Naomi, revealing the decades of deception that had led to Elijah's psychological collapse. Elijah's loved ones, including his children, were called to testify. Abigail, his eldest daughter, wept as she spoke. Despite everything that had happened, she still believed her father was a good man. She pleaded with the court to consider the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the case, but no plea could change what had already been done. After days of intense deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Elijah King was found guilty of first-degree murder. However, considering the psychological impact and the circumstances leading up to the crime, he was spared the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Elijah showed no surprise. He simply nodded as though he had already accepted his fate. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, he remained silent. Only once did he turn back to look at his children. In his eyes, there was no anger, no hatred, only regret for the life that had been lost. Outside the courthouse, the debate continued. Some believed justice had been served. Others felt Elijah deserved more leniency. But one thing was undeniable. His case stood as a chilling reminder of the devastating power of secrets, the danger of suppressed rage, and the heavy price of taking justice into one's own hands. Do you think Elijah's sentence was fair? If you were on the jury, how would you have ruled? Share your thoughts below. The case was closed, but its aftermath lingered. The King family, once a symbol of morality and faith, was now nothing more than the remnants of a tragic downfall. Naomi and Henry were gone. Elijah was imprisoned for life, and his children, the ones who suffered the most, were left to navigate the wreckage of a shattered existence. After Elijah's sentencing, his children were placed in the foster care system. With no relatives able or willing to take them in, they were separated, each forced to start over in an unfamiliar and challenging new life. The memories of their parents, of family dinners and laughter, faded into distant echoes in their minds. The community where the King family had once thrived was no longer the same. The church where Elijah had once preached fell into crisis. Some members abandoned their faith, disillusioned by the betrayal and hypocrisy. Others saw the tragedy as a harsh lesson, a reminder of the destructive power of long-buried secrets. In prison, Elijah lived in silence. He no longer preached, no longer spoke of justice or faith. He spent most of his time in his cell, reading the Bible, though the words he once knew by heart no longer held the same certainty. When asked if he regretted what he had done, his response was simple: "There are sins that cannot be erased, no matter how many times you pray." Elijah King's story was not just a murder case. It was a tragedy of betrayal, of long-repressed rage, and of a man consumed by darkness when the truth became too unbearable. It was a stark warning about the weight of hidden secrets, the psychological scars of family trauma, and the irreversible consequences of choices made in the heat of pain. Was Elijah truly a victim of a tragedy beyond his control, or did he ultimately turn himself into an unforgivable criminal? Leave your thoughts below, and let's discuss this case together.